well, thank you all for joining us today. This is the CASPA outreach training session on unique student situations and the FAFSA application. The idea behind this session is, as you all know, we do trainings quite frequently about the FAFSA application and how to submit it, but it goes very general, and there's always deeper questions that come up as we start working on a student-by-student basis through that application. And so our idea was to hopefully bring a panel to you that you could bring your situations to and ask questions. And so this isn't a presentation like we've done in our other sessions. This is more of a conversation point, a point for you to ask those questions and us hopefully help you figure out your situations as you assist your students this year. A few housekeeping items before we get started. We have a large group registered to be here. I think given the state of things right now, we have a lot of people that will not be joining us. So at this point, we're going to look at that as a positive, as it's going to be easier to have a little conversation with a smaller group. So you all are welcome to have your videos on if you want to in this session. If we start to lag a little bit in audio, we might ask you to turn them off unless you're speaking. I will ask that you keep your microphones muted until you speak, and then probably in the interest of not talking over everyone, if you just raise your hand when you have a question or want to speak, then we'll open it up to you, call you out, and then you can ask your question. You can also submit questions via the chat box if you don't have a microphone or if you're just more comfortable doing that, and we'll read them out to the group and then answer your questions that way. We do have this session broken down into a few sections. However, we want to cover any questions that you have. So if you have questions that don't fall within these sections, that's okay. Just ask your question when we get to the end. Before we get much further, I want to have our panelists introduce themselves this morning. So first of all, my name is Whitney Asher. I'm with Barton Community College. I'm the Assistant Director of Financial Aid here, and I've been in financial aid 13 years now. So I've seen a lot of unusual situations. And I will say, as I think the others will too, there's always something new. So Melinda, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Melinda Harrington. I'm the Director of Financial Aid at Garden City Community College. I've been in financial aid for about 18 years, and I agree with Whitney. We do see a lot of different situations. And I think the best advice I'd like to give right up front is encourage your students to reach out to their financial aid administrators. Sometimes we don't know their situations, and we can't pry. So having them come to us and talk about it is probably my #1 tip so far.
Jordan?
I'm Jordan Underwood, and I'm with the University of Kansas. I'm a financial aid counselor, and I am the dependency override coordinator here.
Of course, our fire alarm is going off. Sorry, guys. Sedania.
My name is Sedania Lane. I'm currently the Director of Financial Aid at Tabor College, and I've been in financial aid for 13 years. So yeah, it's never a dull moment. Something's usually changing, and I agree with Melinda, like encourage them to reach out. You don't know what you don't know and how to fix it if you don't know.
Chantal?
I'm Chantel Arnold. I'm a financial aid counselor at Fort Hays State University. I've been here for 15 years, and I would echo Melinda and Sidonia. That communication piece is something in our digital world with our students. They don't really want to reach out, and if you can encourage them to do that, we can help them much better than if they just send us an email. There's a lot of assuming in emails, and it's easier to ask a question if they're willing to call us. So. I think what we're going to do, and I'm going to step in since Whitney's fire alarm is still going off, we're going to start with any questions you guys may have about dependency. What makes a student a dependent student versus an independent student? And, you know, in a situation where maybe they shouldn't be dependent, what can they do? So if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, we'll try to answer it, or put it in the chat and we will get to it. while we're waiting for someone to be brave enough, we had a question come in beforehand, and I'm just going to try to read this as it was sent to us. Not only is it a dependency question, it also deals with possibly some undocumented issues. So it says both parents have been deported back to Mexico. The student is now living with an older sibling. The student does have some income coming in from rental properties that the parents left to her name before leaving the country. The student uses the income from the rental properties to send money to the parents in Mexico. The questions are, can she be identified as an independent student? Will the money from the rental properties be used as her income minus the money she sends to Mexico? And then, is this a case where a professional judgment may benefit the student? So Melinda and Jordan, if you guys want to take a stab at that.
Sure, I'll go ahead, and Jordan, pop in at any time. The student would not be considered independent just because their parents live outside the country. So the FAFSA is always assessing the family's income and ability to pay. So even though they don't physically live together, the student should still report the parents as their biological parents on the FAFSA. With that said, then the next question that I would have to the student would be, do the parents have any income? And if that answer is yes, then the parents would actually convert their income into US dollars and enter that onto the FAFSA. And then, of course, it depends if they filed a foreign tax return in Mexico, or if that's yes, then they would answer that question as well. So just because they don't physically live together, the parent is still required to enter their information on that student's FAFSA. In regard to her income, yes, she would have to report her income, rental income, on the FAFSA. In addition to that, she would not minus out the income she sends to her parents, because it would just be her income that she needs to report. And there's no reason to do a dependency override or a professional judgment in this situation. Jordan, do you want to include anything else?
Sorry, you hit on all the important points on that one. Yeah, I don't think there's anything else.
Do any of the counselors have questions about that situation? I know it might not seem fair. However, we do have to abide by what the FAFSA, questions say and the instructions on the FAFSA, but we are open to discuss any of that if anybody wants to.
Something that I might add is, I know it states that they're living with an older sibling. If that sibling is also going to school, they would count that sibling as a member of the household. It wouldn't just be the parents and the student in question. The sibling, if they're going to school, would also be counted in the household.
Yeah, that's a good point, Chantel. And also any children who might be living in the household in Mexico, they're looking at the entire family. So when they answer those questions about how many people live in the household, they need to think about it's kind of a combined household.
Okay, thank you, ladies. We do have another question in the chat. How do you help students when the parent is not helping with filling out the FAFSA? Without filling out any information, FSA ID, or getting started on the FAFSA. So how do you help students when the parent's really not helping out?
This is a typical.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is a typical situation where we encourage students to reach out to the financial aid department at the different schools that they're potentially looking at going to, because when parents are refusing to provide information, that can lead us to a PJ on sub situation, Or in a lot of cases, I find with these types of students, it actually can lead to a dependency override, but they have to have that conversation with their financial aid department to even get that process started.
Yeah, at my prayer school, and we do it at Tabor also, we have a parent refusal form that the parent would sign. And when that comes in, what we have found is typically it's just the parents, they don't understand the FAFSA and why their information is being asked of. So it's kind of a nice talking point that then we have their contact information for that refusal form that basically states your son or daughter will only get unsub. That's not great for a situation like Tabor because typically our cost of attendance with private schools is significantly higher. So even just an unsub, there's a huge gap. And so it opens the door where we can contact the parents and have that communication piece and explain to them why their information is needed. They're not held accountable for anything the students take out. And it's just an education piece. And typically people will turn around and change their mind. Now, if there's a unique family dynamic, because I've had that happen, for instance, the student had their parents were divorced and the biological dad's new wife refused to help his daughter. And so it was just one of those, didn't want to open that can of worms. We knew there wasn't going to be any resolution there. So we went to her biological mom and stepdad and went that route, just so then we could get her the federal aid piece. So again, it just comes to having conversations with students, either it be communication or finding out what's going on. And kind of like Jordan said, is there's a resolution we can find within the regs that, abides by that, but also our own internal policies.
I will add to that too. It's really easy for students to want to, when a parent's not willing to provide them information or help them get the process going, it's really easy and tempting for students who are really tech savvy just to hop out there and create an ID for their parents and try to get the ball rolling that way. And as well-intentioned as that might be, and as well-intentioned as it might seem to help a student through that process, when you create an FSA ID, you're creating an electronic signature for an individual. And it's very clear in the instructions that only that individual should create their FSA ID. And I can tell you from experience, as I'm sure our others can too, that when a student creates an ID for a parent or even vice versa, it creates a lot of problems down the road. So always encourage them to keep trying. And if they're not getting anywhere, like Jordan said, that's when you really want to have them reach out to their financial aid office at the school that they're looking at attending to get that guidance. Just a couple of days ago, I had a counselor call ask a similar question to this. And she's like, what do we do? They're not going to provide anything. And I told them just to go ahead, have the student fill out her part, sign it, and get as far as she could, submit it that way without parent information, and we'll take it on our side once we get that information. So always encourage them to take the honest route. This is always an opportunity to teach integrity to our students, not to try and to work the system a little bit and just keep moving forward, because that's what they want to do. They want to keep moving forward and they feel like they're doing the right thing. But in these situations, that's not what you want to do.
Well, as a side note to something you said there, that student situation I was explaining, the girl had a falling out from biological dad and stepmom. Stepmom had created her FSA ID, all the security questions, and held that information hostage from the student. So if you have a situation like that, because again, it's never a dull moment in financial aid, your student has to be sitting with you when you make that call. I believe we called COD, and they had to verify her identity over the phone. They weren't allowing me to do it. I was just there to kind of be the middle person. So it is a situation that can be resolved, but the waters do get muddled.
And I would just like to add that, and I saw in the chat there that this is a student that could break a cycle, and the mom just doesn't want her to move forward. It is so unfortunate.
Yeah.
So my idea or my tip, I guess, probably won't help in this situation, but it might help in others. I like to call the student in and say, well, can I call your parent for you? Can I explain it to your parents that this doesn't mean that they're responsible to pay your bill? I like to have that conversation with the parents. And then when I talk to the parents, you know, I'm telling them the FAFSA information is only used to assess your ability to pay. It doesn't mean that, you know, you are responsible or she's going to borrow a student loan. And sometimes just hearing it from an aid administrator versus their own child can really help. So I want you to really encourage those students struggling to reach out to us. And maybe always even say, you know, the director of financial aid, because sometimes just getting to that, hopefully that spot and somebody can call them, like somebody with authority or, you know, some explanation can really help. Again, if it's impossible, the parent refuses because the parent doesn't want to give up that control of their child, which is unfortunate. The unsubsidized loan would be the only route that we could do. And then hopefully maybe we could help them institutionally with scholarships. There's all kinds of scholarship opportunities on campus and even outside of the colleges that as a high school counselor, you should be helping that student maybe find those resources.
Do you all have any other questions regarding a student's dependency? And so on the FAFSA, when you've assisted students, these are the questions that come up that help us determine if a parent's information is required to be used. So the questions about, you know, are you born before a certain date, which for our students graduating in 2021, that would be January 1st, 1998. Are they a veteran? Are they active duty military, married, have children or other dependents that they support, their parent status or their parents deceased, were they in foster care after the age of 13, dependents or were the court after the age of 13, emancipated minor and legal guardianship, or at risk of being homeless. These are the dependency questions that help us to determine whether or not a student was required to include parent information. So do you all have any other specific questions regarding the dependency information?
One thing I'd throw in there is a lot of students do not read all those questions fully. If you're helping them file a FAFSA and you know it's a student who potentially might qualify to be an independent student, really have them read those questions carefully and truthfully answer them. A lot of students forget about if they were deemed to be homeless by the liaison within your school district, and that is a route that makes it very easy for them to be an independent student if they've been deemed homeless through the McKinney-Vento Act. That is one of those situations where they get that independent status without having to jump through the hoops potentially of the dependency override. I've had many students who go through submitting all the documentation to us for a dependency override, and they submit in that letter for the McKinney-Vento that they were deemed homeless, and I'm like, we didn't need to do any of this. You filled out all this extra paperwork for something that you could have answered one question on the FAFSA and you would have been already in that status.
I don't know.
Looks like we do. Go ahead, Melinda.
Sorry, I just have a question.
Okay.
I don't know if this is a dependency question, but it's a question. So I have a student who's a senior. He has lived and attended our school. He's lived with his grandparents since, I don't know, at least the whole time he's in high school. His mom is living, but she lives in another state, and she lives in Wisconsin. And his dad he doesn't know his dad. He never talks to him. Maybe he's in prison. So who does he? I mean, it seems like he would need to turn in his have his mom as his person, right? But does he do that even if she has not claimed him on her tax return, even if the grandparents have?
Yeah.
Okay. So then she just turns in he needs to get her tax return information for his FAFSA, and he puts in, I don't know if he has any income of his own.
And if she is remarried, if the mother is remarried, it would be required to use the stepdad's information as well.
Sure.
The only exception would be if there's abuse, abandonment, neglect, a toxic relationship. If there's anything like that, then it needs to be a deeper conversation with that financial aid officer.
Okay. Thank you.
We have,
a couple of questions in the chat.
yep, I see those. We have one regarding a student and a green card status. I have a student who is currently in the process of getting her green card status. Her and her foster family have been working on this for over a year now and still have no answers. How do I advise moving forward with the FAFSA application?
I'll take this one. So yeah, a lot of students do fall in this category. A lot of our population that we work with fall in this category. So if the student does not have a green card, they're not eligible for FAFSA. However, if they are a DACA student, they can still fill out the FAFSA because they have a social. And that might be really important for other institutions to determine institutional scholarship. So we do encourage DACA students to complete the FAFSA, even though they're not eligible for FAFSA, in case they're eligible for scholarships at another school. Now, if the student does not have a green card and is not a DACA student, so that would mean that they do not have a social for work-only authorization. In that case, they cannot complete a FAFSA without a social. However, I would encourage the student and those people who are supporting her to continue with the green card process. The key with financial aid is as soon as they get that green card, they become eligible for the entire academic year. So that's really important. So say right now they don't have their green card. As soon as they get it, they should apply for FAFSA and say that I'm a freshman in college and I get my green card in March during my college freshman year. I can actually gain eligibility and we can actually pay students for the fall semester and the spring semester if they gain that green card eligibility within the academic year. So that's a lot of information, but it's just keep on telling them to plug away and try to get it. As soon as they become eligible with their green card, they need to contact their financial aid officer.
Okay, because I work primarily with foster students only. I'm through the Kansas Kids Gear Up program. And I've been working with this family for quite some time now, just trying to figure out what our process is. And they are lost. They don't know what to do. And I've kind of been telling them all these things. She's not a DACA student. She doesn't have a social.
Okay.
And they're trying really hard to get the green card. And I've been diligent with trying to communicate with all the other people that's involved. But I just hate for this student to lose out because she's incredibly smart. She's going to be an awesome medical personnel. So I just want to make sure that I'm doing everything in my power to get her where she needs to go.
It really sounds like you are. The only other suggestion is institutional scholarships. Sometimes if we're aware of those students, especially with a great GPA coming out of high school, we try to find an activity on campus that we can fully scholarship them. So whether it be band or drama or, athletic training or whatever, even we have a STEM program here at Garden City Community College, a Bridges program with K-State. So we try to really tailor their scholarships to fit their needs. So depending on where she's going, you might ask the financial aid officers or the scholarship people, what opportunities does this particular student have, and let them know that she's not eligible for all the federal aid.
Okay, because we haven't even applied for colleges yet because she doesn't have the social. And so that was one thing that I need to start communicating with those colleges, just saying like, we got to get her in somewhere.
Right.
But we don't have
and
numbers.
I'm not for sure about universities, but at our school, we don't require a social for admission. I don't know about Tabor or some of your universities.
No, okay, awesome. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question in the chat. And let's see, I'm going to go back to it here. Can you quick review which parent should fill out the FAFSA if the parents are divorced and there's two homes?
So the parent that provides majority of the support to the student should be the one that the student is putting on the FAFSA. If both parents are providing equal support, the student has kind of their option of which, and when we say support, it's financial support is what we're looking at. Most of the time, students are going to put the parent that they reside with majority of the time.
And I will just add that if they're divorced or separated, the parent that they choose, if that parent is remarried, they do have to include that parent, that step parent's information. That's a big myth or misconception.
Yeah.
They think they only have to put in their moms and not their stepdad or vice versa. But that is incorrect. If the parent that they choose is remarried to somebody else, they have to include that parent's information.
And
Really-
I would add that it has nothing to do with tax status. You know, in a divorce decree, it may be every other year this parent claims, or this parent claims them all the time, but they're still not paying that 51%, and the student doesn't live with them. It really is based on who is paying 51% for that student. It has nothing to do with the tax status, whether they claim them as an exemption or not.
It really comes down to the household itself. And so since the step parent is in the household, then the step parent's income has to count in. But with that said, if there's siblings they gained through mom or dad's remarriage, those siblings would also be counted into the household on the FAFSA. And also if they were enrolled in college, also that number would need to be reflected.
The part where I see students getting really confused about, or parents getting really upset about having to add in a step parent's income information is when, you know, we're going off of the 2019 tax year and they're filling it out in 2021 or even 2022, but they weren't married in 2019. That's when they seem to get really confused about adding in that step parent's information. So just rest assured that if the parents are married at the time the FAFSA is completed, then that's the household, that's the income that needs to be included, regardless of how they filed during that tax year.
That's
a
also
very
something.
common question.
Yeah, that's also something that's important. If you have a student whose parents are going through a divorce right now and they are filling out their FAFSA, that is something where we can go in and separate the parents' incomes on the FAFSA to the parent that is going to be, once the divorce is final, to the parent that is going to be their majority support. We can separate out those incomes so that it is reflective of the household now, even since we're using 2019 tax information. So if you have a student whose parents are going through something like that, that is something that they'll want to talk to their financial aid office about doing special circumstance or PJ review on.
We did have another question in the chat regarding FAFSA completion. Can we look up to see which of our students have completed a FAFSA somewhere? And the answer to that really for you as a high school counselor, no, you're not going to be able to look that up comprehensively and see which of your students have completed a FAFSA application or not. When you're assisting a student and you're not sure if they've completed one previously, there's my fire alarm again. You can go in and have them sign in, and it will tell the student if they've submitted a FAFSA or not. And have someone take the next question in the chat.
I was just going to make another suggestion on that. If you want to, you could have like maybe your government class, or, you know, get them all in a FAFSA lab type of situation and have them log on and ask them to just log in, and you can see their student aid report with them if you feel that obligated to actually, you know, further assist them with the FAFSA. So again, the key, like Whitney said, would be to have the student log into the app or to the website and actually view the student aid report. So the prompts come up and it says you have started a FAFSA, but you have not completed it. Or it might say you have completed the FAFSA. You can view your student aid report. Sometimes we refer to that as their SAR. And that SAR is a very good piece of information that they can share with other people, or even scholarship donors who are asking, is your FAFSA done? So that is a way that you could help to see if they have done what they needed to do, or if a parent's trying to figure out if they have done what they need to do.
There is a really good infographic that I've been looking for that will show who is a parent, kind of going back to that question we had a few minutes ago. If I'm able to find that, I'll post that in the chat and we'll get that sent out to everyone. But it kind of explains who the parent is and what they need to include for the tax return.
There was a question about exceptions for foster students. Whitney went through the list of questions that determine dependency, and there is one that asks, are you an orphan or ward of the court? If a student can answer yes to one of those in that type of situation, then it makes them independent. And I know here in the state of Kansas, another avenue that I might look at then is when they're looking at colleges is tuition assistance for those programs as well. But that question is specifically addressed on the FAFSA.
I would add to that sometimes they can be in foster care and not actually be a ward of the court. Mm-hmm. And so that is the determination there. They do have to have a court document stating that they are in a ward of the court. If it's an emergency placement where maybe they were just there to give families a breather and it worked out and they went back home without going through the court process, then that would not be the same as being an official ward of the court.
It really may depend. The reason they were removed from the household is the emergency situation. Again, I would recommend they contact the financial aid office, any of the offices of the schools they're looking at, just to bring up those conversations and see if it's possible grounds for dependency override. Obviously, if there was abuse or neglect, or if police were involved or something like that.
Looks like there was a follow-up question to the parents' marital status. And I think maybe we touched on it a little bit, but just catch it in case. So if the parents are married now, but were not in 2019, will students include income from 2 tax returns? And so the answer is yes, they will. They'll combine the information for the step parents and the biological parents off of those tax returns, and that will be the information that they enter on their FAFSA application. And that can get tricky, so they can always reach out to financial aid offices for assistance with that. We are always more than happy to help people complete it correctly going in. It makes it a lot easier for them and for us on the other side. So when you say contact the financial aid office, as in they need to be narrowed down to which college to contact. Also, how far in the FAFSA process do they need to be to get specific help from you?
I would say they call us when they ask what is a FAFSA. We can help them from the very first step all the way through the end. Every student is different. Every student's support services are different. First generation students may need more guidance, but I've seen graduating seniors that are filling it out for the first time without mom that need as much help as the 17-year-old high school seniors. So we would help them at any point. They don't have to have certain things done before they can call us. They can call us and just say, what do I do? And we would help them with that.
And they can really contact any of the financial aid offices that the schools are looking for, or if there's one even in their local community. I'm based out of Wichita, so I've always used that line of reasoning, even for students going into repayment, is you have that resource in your backyard that if you want to call or walk in and just ask some of those most basic questions, it'll kind of help lead the path that you need to take for that. But I know here in the state, like, we're all willing to help each other out. It's not a competitive thing at all. And so in terms of the process, the earlier the better, just because you can start filling FAFSAs out October 1st for the next academic year. If your school, it's not your school that selects you for verification, it's the FAFSA itself, the central processing system. And so you want to get a lot of that stuff done as quickly as possible because awarding can take place mid to late fall, early spring at most of those colleges. So it's trying to wrap up, and you can be doing all of this at any of those. If you put 6 schools, you can be doing all of this for all 6 schools. So then you can make your determination at the end of the day, help your student where they want to go.
There
Absolutely.
was a comment that was made in the chat that says, I've been advised you can't legally ask students about a green card. I wouldn't say I've been advised that, but I would say that I can agree with that. You probably can't ask them directly, but you can ask some questions if it is helping them to fill out their form. You know, the question is, do you have a social security number so we can fill this out? At that point, they might volunteer information about what they do or don't have. And those would be things that you could use to approach those students to get to that without directly asking what their citizenship status is. And I don't believe that you could get in trouble, but I would refer you to legal counsel at any point if you think that could get you in trouble.
I think like most of you in your field, we find students just don't want to open up because their situations are so unique. I had one this last year. It was a really bad situation, and students just need to understand financial aid offices are there to help, but also like we have to abide by a lot of the same guidelines in terms of privacy. And so a conversation or documentation submitted as part of a professional judgment or dependency override, like it is heavily protected and it is not shared with the people that it does not need to be. It stays within the financial aid office. And so I would also urge your students to not feel that, I think, shame or guilt to reaching out and having those conversations with us. We've been trained to find solutions. And so just helping them to understand that, you know, we're a trustworthy source too, to help them through the process. So I know that sometimes it's trying to break down that stigma of, I don't want to tell one more person, it's none of their business. And I understand that, but sometimes it's the only way we can ultimately help.
I'd like to add to that a little bit because she's absolutely right. And when we have close relationships with our high school counselors, I actually just sometimes ask the counselor to come in with the student, and that just adds an extra comfort layer for that student because they're telling me instead of telling a stranger something, they have somebody else sitting beside them, a support person, whether it be a coach or a high school counselor or even their favorite teacher in high school, allows them to feel a little bit more comfortable opening up to a stranger like me. And so I do encourage you to extend that extra hand and that extra support to these needy students who are in that situation.
I have had instances similar to that where maybe they didn't come sit with me, but our counselor called and said, hey, I'm sending you this student. So then I was able to say, you know, Mrs. Stark said you'd be coming to see me. And so it also helped validate and provide them some security. So if you're not able to come with them, if you can just give us a heads up that they're coming, we'll try to make that personal connection with them so that they feel a little more comfortable and they're aware that we are aware of what their situation is.
Yeah, and I see the question, like if they're unsure what college they're going to go to, that's tough. Maybe try to narrow it down to 3 colleges and then make those contacts, or try to go ahead with that dependency override application, or, you know, with all 3 colleges if they're still unsure where they want to go. Just having those conversations with their choices of colleges if they're not, you know, if they don't know for sure yet. And then once they do make their decision, I think it's really important to support them as they move forward.
And with that support, that can also be in the form of when we ask for professional judgment or dependency override documentation, a lot of that comes down to a third party. We're going to read the student statement, but we need a third party to validate what the student is saying. And that's where counselors, the high school homeless liaison, principals, teachers, people who are aware of the situation can help to speak into the student's situation and matter and help to provide that documentation for us to keep on hand and make those decisions. So just bear that in mind too.
And I really do encourage you to kind of have a conversation with your students now while they're still in high school, coming in as a freshman, because I can't tell you how many times a student doesn't come and talk to us until their junior, senior year. We talk to them, we're finding out these things. They could have qualified for a dependency override their entire college career. We can't go back to that freshman, sophomore year. Once those academic years are closed, we can't go back to aid from those years. So the sooner they're talking to us, the sooner they're having those conversations with us, the sooner we can be like, oh, yes, hey, let's start going down this route. Let's look at this. We can't help them if we don't know their situation, and we can only go back so far.
The same thing goes for even those scholarship opportunities if they are not eligible for FAFSA. A lot of times I don't see those students until the first day of college, and I've already given away every scholarship I possibly can. So make sure that those specific students are also reaching out to the colleges that they're interested in. The early bird gets the worm, right?
And to tag onto that as well, I recently visited with a student who was a junior. He had paid for his entire freshman and sophomore year, had money in his savings from working through high school, so never even filled out the FAFSA. Now as a junior, he's trying to find jobs to work to offset what his FAFSA can get him, and he is a Pell Grant eligible student. He could have possibly preserved some of those savings and carried that through, but he just thought because he had the money in savings, he wasn't eligible for anything. And so he didn't even apply. And so we strongly encourage all students to apply. They don't have to take out the loans, but there are some that are on that borderline and they just think they're not going to get anything. And maybe they get $1,000. You know, $1,000 will buy some books. It will help pay for some food while you're going to school. So we would strongly encourage all students to fill it out and to continue to fill it out so that they do have a representation of where they are and if there's other resources out there that they may not have been aware of. It doesn't hurt. It takes a little bit of time, but you know, they've gone great strides to protect income so that we can't even see what different income is. I know that's an issue. Parents don't want to fill it out because people will know what I make. That's now protected, and we can see very limited information. And so there's definitely an advantage to doing that. And one of the questions that came in before we started this call in preparation for this was, how does the FAFSA work when students are looking at multiple schools with widely different cost structures? And as you can see from the panel, we have widely different cost structures represented on this call, but each and every one of us use the same FAFSA information and the same EFC. So that provides a baseline. And then from there, we can adapt it to our institutions and adapt it to our cost of attendances. But the FAFSA provides a baseline so those students can see, if I do go to Tabor, my cost is this, but I would still be eligible for this Pell Grant. Or if I go to Fort Hays, I would be eligible for this Pell Grant based on this cost of attendance. And so it provides that baseline and helps them to decide which may be more feasible and where they need to look for additional opportunities if that cost is higher. And that's where they really want to go.
I would just like to add, I was just going to add to that question real quick. So when it talks about like the cost structures, like how each cost of attendance is different. So at Garden City Community College, a student may not qualify for an interest-free student loan because my cost of attendance is fairly lower than somebody at Tabor. So it doesn't only, there's a lot of thought and methodology that goes into that. So just because one college is not offering a interest-free subsidized loan doesn't mean that another college could offer that. So the cost of attendance in reference to the FAFSA and how it works, it is, I don't know, a little bit.
Yeah. So the estimated family contribution, the number the FAFSA calculates, the EFC, that stays the same no matter where you go. But each school has their own separate cost of attendance. And that's what we think it's going to cost a student to live and go to school from middle of August to middle of May. But depending on that institution, costs can be minimal or they could be larger. Well, when you put that EFC in there, how we determine a student's need is we subtract the EFC from the cost of attendance. So at an institution like Tabor, a student is going to have a greater need if their EFC is like $3,000. But if another school's cost of attendance is $6,000, they only have $3,000 in need. And so that's what our offices are trying to do, is to offset that need. And I would also say, encourage them to do the FAFSA, like what Chantel was saying. I know at our institution, most of the other private schools in the state, and even some of the state schools, they may have a different packaging methodology for the Kansas grant, the Kansas Comprehensive Grant. So I know for us, we have a lot of students who are not eligible for Pell Grant, but they can get the state grant. So again, as students are looking at schools, shop around and find that out. Encourage them to do that, because that grant could, I came from a state school, I went to a private school. It was a $2,000 awarding difference for that grant. So it makes a big dent in that need that we're talking about when that EFC stays the same. So yeah.
And then also, yeah, during these uncertain times, we never know when a student might need a student loan. Parents lose their jobs, they need to fly home unexpectedly. So we have really been encouraging the FAFSA for that purpose. They thought that they were on a full ride. They don't need FAFSA. They had money in savings accounts. They don't need FAFSA. But with these uncertain times, I can't give anybody a student loan unless they complete a FAFSA. Sometimes that process could take 2 weeks, but if we shut down our college campuses or a parent loses a job immediately, that's a very good reason to have a FAFSA done and completed. And like I think somebody mentioned before, like a loan option in your back pocket, just in case you do need it.
Well, another thing to think about that in these uncertain times, so the CARES Act that came out last fall, each college was given an allocation of money to give to students. And out the gate, they said they have to be financial aid eligible. Well, the only way we can determine a student is eligible for financial aid is a FAFSA being completed. So we had students who chose not to do the FAFSA. And so because of that, they did not get that automatic grant that we were sending out to our students as part of the CARES Act. So again, it's just a bit of a safety net. It's not going to hurt a student. It's not affecting credit like they think it would. So it's just having it there in the emergency that they do need it, they do need a loan, or the federal government sends schools more money.
Thank you, ladies. We do have a question in the chat. Beth, I might ask you to expand on your question a little bit. You asked, can you please address the Pell Grant issuance? And I'm not sure exactly what you're asking. Are you talking about how it's awarded to students? Okay, so it's how it's awarded to students. Does anyone want to take a stab at explaining that? That's going to vary. Packaging and awarding processes are going to vary from school to school. Students are typically awarded aid at the schools they apply to. At Barton, we receive a FAFSA application, review it, do verification if we need to, and then Pell Grant is, as an entitlement, is something that they're going to be offered really above and beyond everything else. So
it's a type of automatic award as long as they've done the verification and everything they need to, and they're eligible for aid for all the other standards that we have to measure. But if that EFC, that estimated family contribution, falls between a 0, and I don't know where the cutoff is for next year yet. It's usually, last year was like around 5,700. If their EFC falls in that range, they're going to automatically qualify for Pell Grant. That's the easiest way to explain Pell Grant, but in terms of it dispersing, there might be some things they have to take care of, like their verification. And then it also depends on, it could depend on how many hours they're taking. So the Pell Grant for this current year is 63.45. Well, our students have to have a 0 EFC and they have to be full-time. And that's a grid that all colleges have to abide by, but then it also looks at, is it going to fit into our cost of attendance? And that's where we work with students, and all of that is on their financial aid offers. So we make them aware of that on the front end.
I would just add that the Pell Grant or any student aid that the student receives is always applied to their college bill first. So they, I don't know if that helps with your issuance, the term issuance, but with the way that we issue it or disperse it is it goes to their student account. So if a student account is paid in full with their Pell Grant or any other aid that they have, and they have a credit on their account, so there's more money left over than what their bill was, then we issue what's called a refund check. And those disbursement dates and refund check dates truly vary from school to school. For instance, I know everybody's shaking their head, but like at KU, they get them the week before school starts. At Garden City Community College, you have to attend 20% of the semester before we disperse. So every school is very different.
I would also like to tag on that the Pell Grant does not have to be, to get it, they don't have to be a full-time student. And that's one of the most common misperceptions that I run into with students is they believe that they have to be a full-time student to be eligible for the Pell Grant, for their loans, for their scholarships, any type of aid, they have to be full-time. And that isn't always the case. Pell Grant can be awarded at a less than half-time status in some instances. Loans usually, in fact, most always have to be at a half-time status, but that can make a difference to students, especially now. They're not the greatest remote learners, and online learning and this fear of what if we're still virtual or online in the fall when I start, maybe they need to be at a 3/4 time status or a less than full-time status. We don't want them to not start and to totally stop their plan because they're unsure of the learning environment. So they should reach out and see they could still be eligible for some of their aid or some of it at a reduced amount depending on that enrollment level. While we would encourage them to be full-time, it tends to keep them out of trouble because they're busier. They can still receive those benefits of federal aid at a less than full-time status. And that's something they need to be aware of in case that's the best scenario for them.
Proration is our best friend. I would also, as they're looking at different schools, I heard this recently, but grants are automatic because they're free money. But I know most institutions, we don't require students to accept grants. The biggest reason is the federal government requires us to disperse them if the student's eligible and they've done everything they needed to for them. But some schools do require that active acceptance. And so they may want to inquire about that as they're talking with those financial aid offices. Just an FYI.
Fort Hays, for example, does require that they accept it. And it's kind of a twofold process. We're making sure they're making a conscious decision that they are accepting this grant so that they're aware that they got it. We have a lot of students that don't even know how they paid for school. They just accepted everything. They accept it when they accept or decline all of their other aid. Also, then they're aware there is a limit on how much Pell Grant you can get. And so we don't want them just to disperse when the student would rather have it next year when maybe they are going to be independent and
they're in their last year of eligibility. And that's a conversation that we're able to have with them. So we are a school that does require active acceptance. But like Sidonia says, they don't. So it does depend on which school they're attending, and that would definitely be something they would want to check on.
Okay, I'd like to just address one other comment that's in the chat, and then we're going to move on into our last kind of topic area of professional judgments and dependency overrides. We had someone make a comment that you have a parent who refused to do the FAFSA because they are so cautious of who they give their socials, et cetera, to. They know they won't be eligible for a Pell Grant, so they don't see a need. Depending on the school that the student wants to go to, that might be okay. If they know that they don't need or they won't qualify for a federal Pell Grant, and that they know they don't want to use loans perhaps, then a FAFSA is not always required. Some schools, and I'll speak for Barton, I'm not sure the others, but at Barton, to receive any of our institutional scholarships, we actually require a FAFSA be submitted if you're an eligible student. So if you're a citizen and able to complete a FAFSA, then we require it. And it goes back to some of those scenarios we had where students didn't learn until they were maybe a junior or a senior that they were eligible for a Pell Grant. We were finding that with our students. They were low cost, and so they can easily pay for us or for their bill at Barton. But they were missing out on their benefits because they weren't doing the FAFSA. So we added that on as a requirement. I'm not sure if any of the rest of you have similar requirements with the FAFSA application, but students will need to check with their schools that they're attending and see if there's any requirements such as that. But you know, it's always up to the parents and the students. If they absolutely don't want to do it, then they may not be required to.
The only thing that I would add is maybe reassure the parent that their information is protected constantly by financial aid administrators, that the only people that see their social is going to be the government, which the government already knows the social, of course. Mm-hmm. So the FAFSA is a government entity. You might reassure them that, and then reassure them that there are so many layers of protection within the financial aid office who actually receives their social. I don't know if that might help them a little bit.
Yeah, and in fact, part of the headache we all experience with the FAFSA application and the FSA IDs is largely because of the security they have protecting students and protecting parents' information. It makes it a challenge for us on a lot of levels, but it's worth it. And we tell our students that repeatedly, that yes, this is a challenge, but it's okay because they're protecting you. Yeah.
Those FAFSAs go through a series of checks. They're going through the Social Security Administration. So like they were saying, like it's only the government that's seeing this, the Department of Homeland Security, Immigration and Naturalization Services. And even now for verification, they can do the data retrieval with the IRS, even for verification stuff that has to be turned into schools if the student is selected, socials are now redacted. So again, we're not seeing that information, we're protecting the consumer.
One of the things I wanted to make sure we had time to talk about today was any questions you all might have regarding income information that goes onto the FAFSA application, given the circumstances we're living in right now and the effects that it is having on our students and their families and their income. Your students are going to be reporting income from 2019 for their household. As we are well aware, that is not going to be a complete and accurate picture for some of those families as they're filling out the FAFSA application as to what their current income might look like. So does anyone want to talk through, Jordan, maybe you, do you want to talk through a little bit of what can be done with professional judgments? And then if you all have any questions on how to guide your students, we definitely want to give you that opportunity to ask those questions.
So what we are doing at KU in regards to professional judgments for next academic year is we are asking families to wait until they have filed their 2020 taxes to contact us to start the professional judgment process. Students need to go ahead and file that FAFSA, get that FAFSA filed as soon as possible, because a lot of schools do have FAFSA deadlines in regards to certain optional grants like federal SEOG, Kansas Comprehensive Grant. We have a December 1st priority deadline, and the students who have FAFSA submitted before then, if the student submits it after, may not be considered for those additional grants or additional opportunities. So have them go ahead and get that filed. That's the number one thing. But then if they've had significant changes, what we are doing is we are going to be able to take in the 2020 tax information. Each school will handle this a little bit differently on if they're going to start their process now, if they're going to wait until taxes are filed. But we're asking that families go ahead and get their taxes filed. And then what we're going to do is have them submit that documentation to us, because we can go in and update the FAFSA to reflect current situation for the family versus 2019, since it is 2 years difference. We are looking at, we have to take into account unemployment benefits. So if they received unemployment benefits, we're going to have to include that. We have to include any type of income if they happen to potentially cash out portion of a 401k or IRA, that has to be included in the family income as well. So that's why we've got to look at it as a whole picture, but we can still address those changes.
Do any of you have questions about any of this, or are you encountering any situations with your students where you're seeing this might be necessary? I will say that when you're working with students and you know this is their situation, the thing to remember is when you're completing the FAFSA or helping them complete the FAFSA, they still need to use the information as reported and as requested from 2019, even though they know it's different. And then it will be up to the school that they're going to or that they're working with to determine what can be adjusted for income on the FAFSA itself. So the school will go back in and make those adjustments. You don't want to have them make it themselves up front, and that is a common mistake. And it's something that we'll correct, so we'll go back and change it to what it should be, and then we'll go in and look at what adjustments can be made.
One thing to keep in mind, if the student is thinking about going to multiple, considering multiple schools, each school is going to have their own professional judgment process, and each school has to do that independently. So it is not something where they can just submit all the documentation to one school and it goes across the board for anywhere they're considering going. It is done independently by each school. So it may be best to wait to do that process if they're considering multiple schools until they've really narrowed down that list.
Yeah, I'll definitely echo that. For example, at Garden City Community College, we're using the current income instead of, like, Jordan's school is using the most recent tax year. At Garden City Community College, we look at their ability to pay based off of their current income. So each school is very different, and they each have their own forms to go through that process.
I will say, though, in terms of some of the documentation we collect, we have our own internal forms, but a lot of times we may be requesting some of the same documents. So, you know, I would stress to them, like, it is a bit of a process, but don't get overwhelmed if you are looking, you've got it narrowed down to 2 schools and now you're having to go through 2 professional judgments, because if someone was laid off, most likely we're both going to ask for the layoff notice. If you received unemployment benefits or Social Security benefits, we're probably both going to ask for that, as well as tax information, pay stubs potentially. So it's just our internal stuff I know will be different. But that stuff, I know ours is, we're probably both going to ask for the same statement of what's your circumstance and why are you asking for this. But I know most internal forms, they take 5 to 10 minutes to fill out. It's that stuff, the documentation that we have to collect, that most likely they can use at both schools.
Absolutely. Our internal form is literally just a statement from the student of what has changed, and then the rest of it is all uploading the same documentation that they're going to give to any other school. So yeah, absolutely.
I'm not seeing any other questions on professional judgments. Do you all have any questions, or are you seeing any situations with dependency overrides that you have questions on? A dependency override is where the school uses their professional judgment basically to change a student's dependency status from dependent to independent. I don't know if anyone wants to talk about that process a little bit at their office. That's one that's largely going to, again, vary from school to school, and it's going to take communication from the student with their financial aid office or officer to share that information.
So I have done dependency overrides at 2 different institutions now. I did them at a community college, and I've now done them at the university level as well. And I will say the documentation that we tend to ask for from the students is very similar across the board. Statement from the student, what is going on? You've got to start the conversation with a financial aid counselor at both institutions I was at, because otherwise we're not providing this documentation to students readily, because most students aren't going to qualify for a dependency override. But we look for a statement from the student. What are your circumstances? We're also going to, like we talked about earlier, looking for those third-party statements. That's where the students may be coming to you or to the teachers for statements about kind of their family situation and what they've described to you, because we would prefer those statements come from not necessarily a family member, from somebody who's in a professional position. We will accept family member statements, but we really do look for those professional letters to come in on that student's behalf. And that is something where we can have less, I would say, not necessarily less, but we don't have to dig as much when they have professional statements versus just family statements. So it's really important that if you have a student coming to you asking you to write that letter, please listen to them. But at the same time, if they're just now presenting their situation to you and you're not really sure of the history, make sure you're getting that information and that what you're presenting is true to that student situation, because those independent status overrides are not something that is done lightly. And it is something that we really need to make sure that the students who truly qualify for them are the students that are receiving them.
And I would just like to add that the dependency override is something that you have to do that the student would have to do every year. So there's a renewal process. And this kind of touches on that, but a lot of you will qualify your students through the homeless liaison, the Kenny Bento option. However, after that freshman year, sometimes those students struggle trying to prove independency status. So if they're actually no longer homeless and they have fixed adequate housing, they might need to then jump over to a dependency override application. Everybody is so unique and different, and it just takes a lot of communication between the student and the financial aid advisor to ask a lot of questions about, okay, while you were in high school, we qualified you this way. However, now that you're out of high school, what's going on with your situation? So they might even be coming to you 2 years after they leave high school, asking you for those support letters, or, they might even need your assistance 2 years later. So I just want to make that note as well.
Well, there's a good question in the chat. Does a college dorm qualify as, quote, fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence?
That's tough. At our school, I can go either way. Sometimes it just kind of depends. If they've been living there for an entire year, including summer session, that might be adequate. However, just because they're homeless or they have adequate housing, I can also look at what's called unaccompanied homeless youth, which means they're still under the age of, I think it's 22, but they don't have a parent accompanying them. So they might still be living in the dorm and have adequate housing. And I use a really nice chart from I can't remember where, but I go through a verbal interview with the student if I can, or through the phone, and I have a nice flow chart that I use. So even a financial aid administrator can deem somebody homeless if they need to. So I use that chart to go through some of those questions. So that's kind of a trick question. I don't know.
It really comes down to, in financial aid, we like to say institutional policy, because again, every school could be different.
Right.
I know for us in my prior school, which was a public 4-year, if a student qualified for a dependency override their freshman year because of the statements that were provided to us, we make them fill out our dependency override form the subsequent years, but there's a spot where they check, is this your first one? If it's their second one, there's also a box that says, has anything changed drastically? And if nothing's changed, we're just going to revert back to that previous documentation and just automatically override the FAFSA, because they're certifying on that new form for the next academic year that they're still meeting what we set forth the year prior. And so in that situation with the dorms, for us, we're a residential campus. Students are only there for fall and spring. I still see dorms as temporary housing. So where are they living in the summer? So they're probably with a relative or living with a friend because their parents are out of the picture, whatever where they were living prior to coming to college. So again, it comes to what's the institutional's policy on that.
Yeah, and just because it might be adequate housing doesn't mean that they're not homeless, because there's other ways that you can qualify homeless. Or it doesn't, just because they have a home and they do have adequate housing doesn't mean that they can still do a dependency override, because somebody might not be supporting them financially, or there might be neglect or abuse within the family, or abandonment even.
Do you mean
there's a
the follow-up question? Do you mean they would need to qualify for the Pell Grant in order to live in the dorms? Is that what you mean by that?
I'm just thinking that if, like, we have a lot of students who the only way they can afford to go to college is if they qualify for a Pell Grant. And what I try to do with them at a community college is they can get a scholarship for something, sing in the choir or be on the yearbook staff or something, then that can pay their tuition and fees, and their Pell Grant can pay their room and board. Then they have a place to go, right? It can work. But if the Pell Grant would go away, they wouldn't be able to afford the housing and room and board costs, right? And so then they would be right back where they started again without a home. So I guess it seems like most of you guys are going that way, that you're saying that if the student, you're not going to usually, in general, you're not going to count the dorm as their adequate home, right? So I was just adding on to that if you were counting the dorm as their home, and then because they weren't, maybe that's the only way they could qualify for Pell. I don't know. I guess I'm curious how if a student doesn't have financial support from parents but isn't qualified as homeless, they would probably still qualify anyway. I don't know.
So at KU, it does again come down to institutional policy, but at KU, the way that we look at it is if the student's aid is the only way that student who counted as homeless before, and if that aid is the only way that they are supplying the adequate housing, without that aid, they are no longer able to afford housing and would end up back into a homeless situation, we would view that as a student who still qualifies for that determination.
Yeah, and that would be the same with us. They're at risk of being homeless because they don't have their Pell Grant to pay for their dorm.
And that would be the same at Fort Hays.
Okay, we've got a few minutes left in our time. So I want to open it up if there are any questions that you all have that we haven't answered, or that you haven't felt led in the discussion to tack on to. Go ahead and share those questions with us. You can either put it in the chat or unmute yourself and ask if you'd like to. But we'd be happy to take this chance to answer any other questions you all have. I will say too, right now, while you're maybe thinking about questions or typing in the chat, I will be sending out an evaluation after this session, and you'll have the opportunity in that evaluation to add any questions that didn't get answered or that maybe you want a little bit of follow-up with. So please make sure you fill out that evaluation, and we'll definitely get back to you and get that information to you. Okay, so Lori's question, what documentation do parents and students need if parent is on disability and doesn't file taxes? The mom also has no technology skills. She says she is overwhelmed with filling out other paperwork for housing for the family, and so she's behind on the FAFSA.
So even if the parent, yeah, even if the parent doesn't have to file taxes, we would still have them provide information on the FAFSA. And they're going to fill out the FAFSA that they don't file taxes. They will have to put on there any disability income that they receive that would be considered part of that taxable income, but they do still put their information on the tax or on the FAFSA.
And I would just say that if she's struggling technology-wise, that's where the student can really help the mom out, right? So sometimes I say, can you bring your mom in here? You know, because sometimes parents don't want to listen to their kids. And so sometimes just having that third person there, or even in your own offices, hey, can we have an appointment with the parent and the student together? And if the mom is struggling with technology and the mom is sitting there and the mom and the student saying, hey, let's get your FSA ID, I'm going to help you. You know, as long as they're both there, they can get through the technology challenges together. So hopefully that helps. And yeah, I think that's a big misconception. I don't file taxes, so I don't need to do anything with FAFSA. You do. Those people really need to fill out the FAFSA because they could be a full Pell qualifier, possibly. So we do want students whose parents don't file taxes to still complete a FAFSA. They just need to answer the questions accordingly.
In worst case scenario, because we've seen situations like that, and we have students across the country, if a parent can't sign a FAFSA electronically for whatever reason, we've tried as much as possible to help them get an FSA ID. The son or daughter has when they're home on break. Worst case scenario, they're talking to the financial aid office. We can always print a copy of the FAFSA that comes into our office, and there's actually a signature page, and the parent can physically sign it. And it'll get sent back to us. It's easier to do it that way. That's how we handle that challenge. And then we go in and document that it's now been signed and we're keeping it on file for our program reviewer purposes. But that's a challenge, or they can mail it, but then it could take an additional up to 6 weeks to get processed. So that's a worst case scenario if the parent just absolutely can't, but there's always a workaround. And absolutely have them report that untaxed disability income because if they're chosen for verification, we'll just, collect what it is. With that said, too, if you have a student, reach out to the colleges. There's things called Parent Plus loans. And if families are on disability and fixed incomes, we don't want somebody on disability taking out a Parent Plus loan. So I know for like my institution and my prior school, we will allow a parent to fill out information telling us they're on a fixed income, and we will automatically override them having to take out or even applying for a parent loan. There's no reason. So there's options like that. And the disability is case in point. Them providing me with a copy of their Social Security benefits allows me to override that request.
One thing I will say is applying the signatures is kind of an institutional policy on who will. We actually will require that the student or parent print off that signature page when they're filling out the FAFSA, and they do have to send it in. We won't apply the signatures for them. So that will be a little bit different per institution.
Mm-hmm. I posted in the chat what's called FAFSA on the web. It's a worksheet that can be printed out. And we've had some parents that are a little technically challenged that just need that paper. And this may help this situation to gather the information. They can't submit the FAFSA this way, but it might help mom figure out what she needs to fill out and help answer those questions, so that then when they do go to a financial aid office or to your office to sit down and fill it out, they would have all of the information. Do note that the one that I put in there is for the current year. The one for next year is not yet up on the website, but this would be fairly close to everything they would need for the 21-22. I don't know if it's available in Spanish, but I'll look and see if I can find it, and I'll post that as well.
There used to be, there should be.
Do y'all have any other questions you'd like to throw out there before we close our time today? Okay, Teresa, I have a student who will need to fill out a change in situation in the fall. His dad has been unemployed since COVID, so the tax return from 19 is not all reflective of their situation currently. How long typically does it take to get results from a change like that?
It's going to depend on schools. Schools could have different turnaround times. Ours is typically 2 to 3 weeks, but everybody's could be different.
For us, it would depend on the time of year that they're submitting the documentation. If they're kind of ahead of the curve, doing it in summer when people haven't started really focusing on the process, we could turn it around in as little as 2 weeks potentially. But when we start getting more of them in, we're going to be closer to that 6-week turnaround, most likely on a special circumstance review.
Then it kind of goes, something Jordan said earlier is, do you have your 2020 taxes filed?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So at Garden City Community College, we would actually wait until about July to look at, okay, does the student's parent have a new job? So we actually wait until, because we're looking again at current situation, what's going on with the parents or the family income. However, we can also talk to those parents and give a verbal, okay, well, if you were making 90,000 and now you're only making 30,000, this is what we're expecting. So we can kind of do some estimates with them, but we truly don't assess their ability to pay until, I mean, we're looking at current resources. So every school is very different.
The other thing I will say is that traditionally, we would wait until summer to look at that. With COVID, we have adapted our policies slightly to allow for us to start making these decisions sooner and helping the students get more information sooner. So it may vary year a little bit when this current situation is no longer into play.
Yeah.
I think the main thing to remember with those updates is that the schools really want to see a true picture of what their current ability to pay is. And so that is largely why, we want to wait to the later part of spring and summer to start doing those kind of adjustments. Because a lot can change between October and April or May or June and on. So always start that conversation though. You can't start that soon enough, and then you can get guidance on what needs to be done.
However, they should be doing their FAFSA now to prepare for that change. So that's really key. Go ahead, even though it doesn't reflect their current situation, they have to fill out the FAFSA according to the instructions using the 19 taxes. If they have that one piece done, that allows us to move quicker when we can assess their current.
And also they don't miss out on timelines.
Right.
Then
Deadline.
Campus-based and state aid.
Yes. Another thing, the only professional judgment that we are doing right now for next academic year at KU is if parents have had a 401k or IRA qualifying rollover, we will go ahead and start that process. But again, that's going to be institutional on when the institution chooses to do that. So it really does, they need to just be reaching out to the institution that they're thinking about going to.
Okay, well, I think we're going to go ahead and close our time today. I want to say thank you to each of our panelists for joining us and sharing your financial aid wisdom with everyone. And for you high school counselors and other other professionals serving our students, thank you so much for all you're doing for the students right now. I know that it is hard. We all know it. So keep working, keep pushing. We're definitely here for you in case you need any assistance. You can reach out to any of our offices and we can answer questions along the way. We're always happy to do that. So thank you all for your time. I hope you have a wonderful day. And don't forget to do your evaluations. Thank you all.
Whitney, we are sending the recording out, correct?
Yes, we will be posting a recording. We have this session today and then we have one tomorrow. So we will be posting a recording of this session by the end of the week on the website. So back where you went to register initially, that's where you'll go to find that recording link. Okay. Thank you all so much. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone.